If you have a Bible, you can follow along with us. We're looking at Acts. We're going through the book of Acts. We're at Acts chapter 19, and we're going to look at the riot in Ephesus. In Revelation, Jesus says to the church at Ephesus, "Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." Now, we come together, and you may be a visitor here, you wonder what we're doing. We come together not just to remember, or to be entertained, or just to sing, or whatever, but we come to hear what God has to say. And Jesus' words about if you've got ears, listen, it's just hugely, hugely important, because some of us don't listen. Those of you who are in long-term relationships, your partner might at some point say to you, "Are you listening to me?" And you go, "Yes." And they say, "What did I just say?" And you say, "I don't know. Because I was listening, but I was also switched off." So switch on. If you've got ears, listen. Now, I also want to make a confession in that I sometimes go to different churches, or more often than not actually watch online or listen to things, and I think this is what has been bothering me. They've been great. The churches that teach the Bible, the music's fine, everything is very organized and slick, and yet I feel, for me, there's something missing. And I'll tell you what, for me, I think is missing. I think I've worked it out, is that sometimes we make our churches so comfortable that there's nothing to disturb us. So by that, I don't mean, look, you've got cushions on the pews. Well, that's for a good reason. If we remove the cushions just to make you stay awake, that's not the best idea in the world. We don't want the place to be freezing or boiling hot or whatever. That's not what we mean by comfortable. But nor do I mean the kind of church that you would go to and they just load you with guilt again and again and again and again. That's not what I mean. What I mean is this, is that as we come into the presence of God and as we listen to what the Spirit says, instead of us going, "Hey, that's great, wow," some of it makes us feel distinctly uncomfortable. And in this instance, it caused a riot. So, verses 23 to 27 of Acts 19, "About that time there arose a great disturbance about the way. A silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. He called them together, along with the workers in related trades, and said, 'You know, my friends, that we receive a good income from this business. And you see and hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray large numbers of people here in Ephesus and in practically the whole province of Asia. He says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. There is danger not only that our trade will lose its good name, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited, and the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty.'" Now, you may not have noticed, but in the culture in general, there's a large amount of talk, particularly in more intellectual circles, about how Christianity is making a comeback and how Christianity would be good for the nation, and be good for business. But what if it wasn't? What if Christianity wasn't good for business? What if Christianity really upset the apple cart? Paul in Philippi was bad for business, and now here in Ephesus. This is the argument that occurs here. Now you'll note that Christianity is called the way. There arose a great disturbance about the way. In fact, Christianity wasn't called Christianity at all. You don't find that. The disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. But initially there was several names that were used, and one is they were known as the way, because it was a way to live, it was a way to follow God. But in this instance, and actually I would argue Acts 16, for example, these are they who've turned the world upside down. Christianity is a way that disrupts and changes the whole of society. So in our culture, people really like the idea, if in the church, we really help society. And that's what we want to do. We do. We want to help with those who are struggling with poverty and addiction and other things. People like the idea of the church doing that. What they don't like the idea of is the church turning things upside down. This is a way of life that was different and a direction that was diametrically opposed to that of the majority. It involved a pattern of self-denial and cross-bearing. It was utterly focused on Jesus Christ, and the worldly despised it. This is really weird, but I like watching church general assemblies. So I just watch them on YouTube, and that, I mean, honestly, that is such a niche area to go to. I think I need psychiatric help, but I've been watching church assemblies so much so that I've had to do some long car journeys because New South Wales trains can't cope with rain, and so I've even had them on YouTube. I've not been watching the YouTube, I've just been listening to them. And one of the things that just intrigued me in the assemblies I've been watching recently is people arguing, how do we make ourselves more palatable to the culture we're in? I think that's quite a dangerous argument. And I'll tell you why. Because the gospel is a challenge. It's a real challenge, not just a challenge to individuals, but a challenge to the city that we live in. In Ephesus, we read that Paul held lectures every day at the lecture hall of Tyrannus. And we read that the whole of Asia, which is what we now know as Turkey, heard the word of the Lord. And we read that the impact of that was this, that commerce and education and art and sport and everything had changed. And here there's a change that occurs that is not very popular. It was extremely disturbing. It wasn't even just what Christians did. It's not that Christians went marching down the street of Ephesus saying, down with that sort of thing. Or Diana's not a real goddess. Or whatever. They didn't do that. But what they did do is this. They refused to enter into the customary gossip that social engagements typically engendered. And that was threatening to unbelievers. The way that they lived, how they did things differently, not in a self-righteous way, but it was threatening. I remember when I first became a Christian, I was working on a farm laborer, taking in the harvest, and basically driving a tractor. I loved that job. And this was in the days before tractors had stereos and TV sets and everything else that they have now, which I don't understand, but they do. And I remember I went to work. I was driving my tractor, and then you stop for your lunch, and you have your peace bag, and your flask of tea and all that kind of stuff. So I had that, and I'm sitting there, and one of my colleagues said to me, "You're awful holy, David." I said, "What? I'm awful holy? What made you say that?" He says, I watched you. He says, "You don't laugh at our dirty jokes. You don't swear." And he says, "I went into your cab at lunchtime because you go in 15 minutes early, and I seen you reading." And he actually said, "I thought you had porn, so I went to see, and I looked in your bag, and there's a Bible." And he said, "You read your Bible at lunchtime? You're awful holy." I said, "Not really." I said, "I'm supposed to read it in the morning, but I get up too late, and so I just take it with me." But what intrigued me was I didn't have to wear a T-shirt saying I love Jesus or anything. It was just what I didn't do that provoked, And I think sometimes that's the case. I used to, when I was at university, I used to go to parties. But I got banned from them because every party I went to, people ended up discussing philosophy and Buddhism and stuff, and they're supposed to be drinking and, getting off with one another, and I just spoilt that by not doing it and discussing lots of different things. But I think that's what was happening. And it caused resentment. So here's this guy, Demetrius. Basically, he's the chief union official. The city I ministered in Dundee had a thing called the 9 Trades, and the trades groups were enormously powerful. And that, by the way, was the same in Newcastle. I went and looked this up, actually. If you go to the Trades Whole Archives, the trades, it's really interesting. I thought it would be miners and cobblers and so on. But I came across boilermakers. There was a trade for boilermakers, the iron molders, and I think my favorite is the train drivers. I had a funeral service here for a train driver, and it's funny how they all came together. So your job, you kind of identified, you were part of a trades group. I guess the equivalent today would be sparkies, plumbers, joiners, roofers, or whatever. But this guy, Demetrius, he was the chief silversmith. Now, the background here is really important. This was how they made their money. This riot occurred during the festival of Artemis, which was a month-long event. And it was a month of debauchery during which pilgrims came from everywhere to participate in athletic contests, drink, carouse, and have a ritual fling with prostitutes. The Roman historian Tatius says that on the festival of Artemis, every place was full of drunken men, and all the marketplace was full of a multitude of men throughout the whole night. Now we have months and weeks and festivals where people do that. And we're supposed to join in and to celebrate it. Well, Demetrius wasn't happy, because it was during that month they made a lot of their money selling these images of, you can see kind of one of them there, of the goddess Artemis, better known to us as Diana. And basically, because so many people were becoming Christians, sales were really down. And so there was trouble. He was concerned that the trade would lose its good name, the temple its prestige, and the goddess her majesty. I think the equivalent today would be, if there's a renewal of Christianity, there may be people whose trade was affected who would suddenly start saying, look what these Christians are doing. This is not Australian values. Now, nobody's yet, by the way, I hear people talking about Australian values. No one's ever been able to tell me what they are, other than in cliches. So if you can enlighten this ignorant foreigner, please feel free. And by the way, the same goes for Scottish values or British values. I have no idea what people mean when they say that. They think they mean something. I'm not sure. But anyway, that's what this guy was doing. He was saying, these go against our values. Now, these silver gods of Diana were considered to be amulets. They were kept in homes, and they were intended to ward off sickness and poverty. Diana was considered to be a virgin who helped women in childbirth, a huntress with bow and arrow, and the goddess of death. So she was pretty important. And it's a bit like, have you seen that? You go into someone's home and there's various icons and so on. I remember being in a Hindu home, and there was a whole, this was an elite Hindu home, a Brahmin home, and there was a whole room devoted to the elephant god. I didn't do this, but if I had said, what a waste of a room, I would have been in real trouble. I mean, these were intelligent, nice people, but they had a whole room in their house devoted to a god who doesn't exist. And then Demetrius, look at the irrationality of what he's saying. In verse 26, he says, gods that are made with human hands are no gods at all. He says that gods that are made by human hands are no gods at all. Well, in the wisdom of Homer Simpson, if the god has to be made by human hands, it's not a god, is it? That's like blatantly obvious. Now, we can look at that and we can smile at that rightly, but we, in our culture, have our own man-made idolatries. Sex, money, power, self-esteem, leisure, fame, sport. In Isaiah 44, one of my favorite chapters in the whole Bible, because it shows that sarcasm and irony are approved by God, or at least used by one of his prophets. Isaiah mocks the people of his day by depicting a man who cuts down a tree, chops half of it into a fire and warms himself and cooks on it. With the other half, he then carves out a god and bows down and worships that god. Well, what the gospel does, we saw that in Acts 17, is it challenges the idolatries of the day. And the idolatry of our day is simply this: to give your heart to something or someone other than the one true God is an act of sheer foolishness. So it creates a disturbance. People say, look, we don't mind if you have your Christianity, But to say that it's more important than everything else, wow. Different cultures have different aspects of this. I have an Iranian friend who, when he became a Christian, it was a big cost for him. He had to meet his parents outside Iran and tell them that he was going to be baptized, and that was hard. Or I think of a Chinese friend whose whole culture was built around family and ancestors, and to become a Christian was seen to be rejecting the ancestors because they weren't Christians, and that was hard. Or somebody else whose whole context was he just loved going out with his mates and drinking on a Friday and Saturday night. And when he became a Christian, he wouldn't go out and get drunk with them. And that was hard. He had to be prepared for his mates to give him up. So it creates disturbance. Then confusion. From verse 28. When they heard this, they were furious and began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Soon the whole city was in an uproar. The people seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia, and all of them rushed into the theater together. Paul wanted to appear before the crowd, but the disciples would not let him. Even some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, sent him a message begging him not to venture into the theater. The assembly was in confusion. Some were shouting one thing, some another. Most of the people didn't even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander to the front, and they shouted instructions to him. He motioned for silence in order to make a defense before the people. But when they realized he was a Jew, they all shouted in unison for about 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." There was mob confusion. There was a protest march. And here you get a really toxic mixture. Nationalism, civic pride, and religious fervor. And there was this confusion. I mean, they're chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." It was a chant that kept getting repeated and repeated. I don't know if you've ever been on a protest march. I used to go on quite a few. My nickname at uni was Red Robo, so that probably indicates where my politics were. And you would chant things. From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, and all that. You didn't know what it meant, really. You couldn't say which river or what sea, but you chanted it, and it felt good because everyone was chanting it. And, another chant, "Love is love." Well, it's great, sounds good. What does it mean? And this is what they were doing. They were chanting. But I love the little line here. Most of the people didn't even know why they were there. There's just a crowd. If you see a crowd going along, sometimes there's a temptation just to follow it, isn't there? I once followed a crowd until I realized they were a bunch of Celtic supporters. And I thought, no, this is the wrong tribe for me. But you follow it. You say, what's going on here? You see a march. What's happening along here? March along Bowman Street sometimes. I see them and you go and find yourself joining in. Well, that's what they did here. Now, the Temple of Diana was enormous. It could accommodate 25,000 people, the great stadium they had there. Up to it was a road called the Arcadian Way, which was 11 meters wide and paved with marble. And what this crowd do is they grab a couple of Paul's companions, Gaius and Aristarchus. Now, there's a really interesting thing here. Paul thought he said, I'll deal with this. And, he's going to go and calm it down, and I'm a Roman citizen, they'll respect that. And he's saved from basically himself by a very unusual people. They're called the officials of the province. They were known as the Asarchs, and they were leading citizens who were members of the council who usually led the pagan worship. And here they were, these people, in effect the city councillors, saving Paul, saying, whoa, don't go there. They'll lynch you. And they saved him from that. And then Alexander was asked to speak on behalf of the Jews, probably so that they could say, look, this guy Paul's got nothing to do with us. He was a Jew, he is a Jew, but he's gone off on this really strange the way thing, and no, it's not part of us. But he didn't even get a chance with that. He was going to say, look, we're a religion that doesn't disturb people. But there was just mass confusion. And again, I think we're at that with our culture. There's just mass confusion about things. I've mentioned before the little entertainment I had on Reddit when I put a sign outside the church and several people around started piling in, and there was a couple of hundred posts on Reddit about the church. And it was so funny, the mass confusion about what this church was. We're full of rich people, well done, you lot. And the new minister is like, he's a mad Scotsman, a Trumpist, who's watch out for him and all that kind of, they're into health and wealth teaching and all that kind of stuff. Just all over the place, different things. And it was lovely, in a sense, to be able to engage and confuse them even more, because there was just enormous confusion. And in our culture, there is enormous confusion about what Christianity is. Sometimes when I hear people bitterly reject Christianity, I say to them, well, I'm with you, kind of. Tell me what you're rejecting. And what they're rejecting is a version of the faith that I don't recognize. But that's what was here. And then there was this deliverance, verses 35 onwards. The city clerk quieted the crowd and said, fellow Ephesians, doesn't all the world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and of her image which fell from heaven? By the way, that's referring to a black meteorite which came down, and from that black stone they carved an image of Diana. Therefore, since these facts are undeniable, you ought to calm down and not do anything rash. You brought these men here, though they've neither robbed temples nor blasphemed our goddess. If then Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a grievance against anybody, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. They can press charges. If there is anything further you want to bring up, it must be settled in a legal assembly. As it is, we're in danger of being charged with rioting because of what happened today. In that case, we would not be able to account for this commotion, since there's no reason for it. And after this, he dismissed the assembly. Now, the Lord has marvelous ways of working, and in this sense, he worked through a bureaucrat, a city clerk, the town councilman. I have no idea who the guy is on the screen, by the way. I just picked him at random from somewhere. He just looks like a bureaucrat, and he is definitely a bureaucrat. But the word that Paul uses is grammatis. Grammatis. The guy, this has always been the same. He was a guy who had an office of permanent clerks who kept records of everything. That's why we know so much about the Roman Empire. That's what happened. And Rome, one of the things that Rome had was very strict rules about riots and about unofficial gatherings of more than quite a small number of people. Now, I think this official was unquestionably scared that his whole city would be punished. And so he makes 4 clear points. He's a very intelligent man. He says, first of all, everyone knows that Ephesus is the guardian of Artemis' temple and image. There's no danger here. This is not going to be taken away from us. Secondly, these men have not robbed the temple or blasphemed. Thirdly, there's a proper legal procedure. If you have a private grievance, you go to the courts and the proconsuls. If it's bigger than that, go to the full legal assembly. How we get the term democratic, the demos. Go to the demos. It met 3 times a month. And fourthly, you guys could be charged with civil disorder. Now calm down and get out of here. And because of that, because of this pagan clerk, Paul and the disciples were again free to preach the gospel. Calvin points out an amazing providence here. He says if Paul had been present in the stadium, you know what he would have done? He wouldn't have been able to keep quiet when he says everyone knows that Artemis is, the goddess. He would have challenged it and would have got lynched. When he said, the clerk says that Diana came down from heaven, Paul would not have been able to keep quiet. He would have stood up and he would have said, hang on a minute, no, Jesus came down from heaven. Diana didn't. It's a rock that's fallen. You've fallen for this, guys. And he really would have blasphemed, and then that would have been the end of him. Now, just God in his providence sometimes ordains things so that that's how these things work out. Well, I want to kind of apply all of this in this way. I think that how we reach people with the good news, I'll deal with that in a minute, but some of you may remember when another Diana died and involved in that. Now, I remember it because I remember the day she died. I remember it was a Sunday. I remember getting it in the news and the radio just before I went off to church. But what really stunned me was the weeks after, the absolute hysteria that gripped Britain, and not just Britain. I'm pretty sure it was here and elsewhere. Derek Thomas observes that he was at a railway station where people were asked to stop at 11 a.m., the train stopped, and stand in silence and mourn Lady Di. But he asked this question, what were they mourning? And he says, I think they were mourning for themselves. I mean, I was sorry she died, but I didn't know her. And why were we mourning? We are hearing more and more about what they call a quiet revival, which makes me instantly suspicious, because if it's quiet, you wouldn't hear it. But nonetheless, we are hearing about it. And I think it's true that people are more interested in Christianity. And I think it's true that Christianity has become more acceptable for many people, but I also think it's true there's something missing. And it's this, that there's this challenge that comes to the culture and to the society. R. Kent Hughes says this, today the Christian church is clothed with dead leaves of materialism and sensuality. A majority of Christian believers have been desensitized to the lures and poisons of the world, the flesh and the devil. Multitudes within the professing church are not only thoroughly infatuated with the charms of mammon, but are practicing sensualists who enjoy the most degrading entertainment without any remorse whatsoever. It grieved Paul greatly when he was in Athens and saw the false worship. It grieved him when he was in Corinth and saw the temple prostitution. It moved him when he was in Ephesus to proclaim the gospel. And yet, it's fun, our brother across the road, Jonah, was in, and we always compare notes briefly as he gives me a coffee. And, the Pentecostal version of revival and our version of it. I think if you put the two together, you'd probably get it about right. But we were just talking just now, and he said, isn't it always the case that when God begins to work, there's opposition? I think that's true. I think that's true. And that's what happens here. And I think that we shouldn't look for opposition, but we shouldn't be surprised when it happens. How do we reach people with the good news? I picked this up from John Stott's comment on this passage. I thought it was really helpful. Our evangelism tends to be ecclesiastical, inviting people to church, whereas Paul also took the gospel out into the secular world. And we have to think how we do that. We have to wrestle with that. I wrestle with that all the time. I was at a conference yesterday, and I was asked, how would you do it? And I had to say, I don't know. I'm struggling with it. I'm wrestling with it. Sometimes our evangelism is too emotional, appealing for decision without an adequate basis of understanding, whereas Paul taught, reasoned, and tried to persuade. And sometimes it's too superficial, making brief encounters and expecting quick results, whereas Paul stayed in Corinth and Ephesus for 5 years, faithfully sowing gospel seed and in due time reaping a harvest. I recall I've just been looking a lot at my old church back in Dundee, seeing how the Lord has blessed it and how it's growing and so on. And some of the seed sown many years ago, how it's come to fruition. And one that's always made me smile was a big Irish rugby player. I'll not name him because he probably watched this. And let's put it this way. He would come to church on a Sunday evening to get Protestant absolution for what he did at the rugby club on a Saturday night. And I thought he never listened to a word I said. And he was with us for 4 years. He went away. I heard nothing for 15 years. And then one day I got a letter saying, Dave, mentioned his name. He said, you're going to be really surprised. I got married a couple of years ago. About a year ago, I became a Christian. And he said, I'm now working for a Christian organization as their lawyer. And he said, I just wanted to tell you something. I never forgot two things. The hospitality I was shown by people in the church and your teaching. He said, it really annoyed me, but I couldn't forget it. And, that's the case. I'm glad you're here to hear God's word. I'm not going to try and manipulate you or push you into doing things, because I believe God's word will work. But it's a very dangerous thing to be here and to hear God's word. Let me tell you that. And that's a wonderful thing. So may God grant, I don't really want groups marching down Beaumont Street saying, burn Scots Kirk to the ground. I really prefer that didn't happen. But nonetheless, I do want us to have such an impact that it arouses curiosity, even opposition, and gets people to think. There's one thing way worse than opposition, and that's apathy. Apathy is the worst possible thing you can face as a church. May God grant that we don't live in an apathetic community, and may He turn this community upside down. Amen.